In recent weeks, fighting around Tourett has appeared unusually subdued. There have been no large armored formations and no sustained artillery exchanges illuminating the skyline. Instead, activity has been limited and mobile. A small Russian motorcycle convoy moved through damaged streets and dirt roads, dispersing as it advanced, relying on speed and separation to reduce the risk of detection. That assumption no longer holds in modern warfare. In today's battlefield environment, movement itself is often sufficient to be detected. Tourett does not represent a single decisive clash or a major offensive. Rather, it offers a snapshot of how the war in Ukraine is increasingly being fought, gradually, quietly, and often without immediate visible contact. The emphasis is shifting away from raw firepower toward observation, timing, and informed decision-making. In this environment, seeing first can be more decisive than firing first. Once the Russian motorcycle convoy entered the outskirts of Tourett, the situation became primarily an information contest rather than a firepower exchange. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones detected the movement and began transmitting live video feeds to nearby fire control and coordination teams. This created a continuous, real-time picture of activity on the ground rather than isolated or delayed reports. Instead of striking immediately, Ukrainian operators monitored how the convoy moved. They tracked direction, spacing between riders, speed changes, and pauses along the route. This allowed them to identify patterns in how the unit navigated damaged infrastructure and narrow access points. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War have highlighted persistent drone surveillance as one of Ukraine's most effective battlefield tools. Its value lies not primarily in immediate destruction, but in reducing uncertainty and improving situational awareness. In this context, the key question was not where the convoy was at a given moment, but where it was likely to be next, as the motorcycles advanced. Ukrainian units adjusted fire planning based on continuous drone updates. Routes were mapped in near real time, enabling crews to identify potential choke points where speed would decrease and maneuver options would narrow. This reflects a modern sensor-to-shooter process in which observation, decision-making, and action are linked through digital systems rather than relying solely on verbal reports. Research by the RAND Corporation has noted that this type of real-time integration shortens decision cycles and allows smaller units to operate more effectively against fast-moving or dispersed targets. Notably, Ukrainian forces did not engage immediately. The decision to delay was deliberate. Experience gained over months of drone-centered operations has shown that striking too early can disperse targets, reveal firing positions, and invite return fire from unknown locations. By holding fire, Ukrainian units allowed the convoy to move deeper into terrain already shaped by natural constraints and pre-planned fields of control. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute have described this approach as space control rather than traditional target hunting. The objective is to limit an opponent's available options before weapons are employed, rather than reacting as soon as a target is identified. This represents a shift from earlier models of warfare, where speed often meant acting first. In Ukraine, speed increasingly refers to decision-making, waiting longer but acting with better information. Drone operators in this scenario functioned less as direct attackers and more as battlefield coordinators, continuously updating ground units while remaining concealed. Each adjustment refined the planned engagement and reduced the need for large forces or prolonged fighting. According to research from the Center for Strategic and International Studies on Ukraine's drone operations, delaying contact often results in fewer munitions expended and higher effectiveness once engagement begins. The events around Tourett illustrate how modern combat is increasingly focused on shaping enemy movement rather than immediately destroying forces. By the time the motorcycle convoy approached the designated engagement area, Ukrainian units had already identified where movement would slow, where riders were likely to concentrate, and where withdrawal would be most difficult. This shared awareness reduced the need for any single unit to maintain full situational control. The drone feed effectively served as a common operational picture for all involved elements. Equally significant is what Ukrainian forces chose not to do. They did not pursue the convoy across open terrain, nor did they attempt to secure immediate confirmation of destruction. These decisions reflect a broader emphasis on control, economy of force, and risk management rather. then rapid escalation. Such restraint reflects lessons drawn from years of attritional fighting, where overextension has frequently resulted in losses without corresponding strategic benefit. Defense analysts often note that Ukraine's battlefield effectiveness derives less from technological superiority than from disciplined use of information, timing, and controlled decision-making. From this perspective, Tourett is not an isolated case. It illustrates a broader shift in contemporary warfare, where controlling space and limiting an adversary's options can be more consequential than holding territory itself. In this model of combat, the most decisive action often occurs before any weapon is employed. By the time engagement begins, outcomes are already shaped through observation, coordination, and deliberate restraint. When contact finally occurred, it was brief and tightly managed. The initial interaction between Ukrainian forces and the Russian motorcycle convoy did not resemble a large-scale clash, but rather a controlled disruption of movement and organization. As the convoy entered the predetermined engagement area, selected motorcycles were disabled through precise strikes. These actions interrupted momentum and fractured coordination without relying on indiscriminate fire or widespread destruction. Military analysts have noted that focusing initial strikes on key elements can prevent rapid dispersal and preserve the ability to control subsequent phases of an engagement. In this case, the early loss of mobility placed the remaining riders in a rapidly deteriorating situation. Within moments, the convoy faced growing uncertainty. Attacks originated from unexpected directions, and the unit's formation quickly broke down as individuals sought cover or attempted to maneuver independently. When movement becomes fragmented, cohesion tends to collapse. Research into battlefield psychology suggests that confusion and disorientation, particularly in confined or unfamiliar terrain, can spread faster than physical casualties, sharply reducing a unit's effectiveness. Rather than exploiting the moment through aggressive pursuit, Ukrainian units maintained restraint. There was no broad advance across open terrain and no attempt to chase fleeing elements into potentially exposed positions. Each movement was deliberate, prioritizing positional security and control over rapid escalation. Military theorists have long argued that such restraint can be strategically powerful, especially when it denies the opponent opportunities to regroup or draw defenders into vulnerable situations. The psychological impact of precise limited fire in a constrained environment proved as significant as the physical damage itself. For the Russian riders, what began as a routine movement quickly became a scenario defined by uncertainty. Choices narrowed to risky withdrawal, improvised maneuvering, or taking cover in unfamiliar surroundings. This controlled disruption degraded not only the convoy's mobility, but also its ability to make coordinated decisions. Studies of modern combat suggest that when a unit loses organizational rhythm early in an engagement, its chances of recovery diminish rapidly, even if overall numbers remain relatively intact. By targeting specific points rather than launching a broad offensive, Ukrainian forces shaped conditions that worked against the convoy's ability to adapt. Urban warfare analysts have observed that light vehicles and dispersed units are particularly vulnerable to precise, directional strikes that disrupt coordination. Around Tourett, terrain amplified these effects. Narrow roads, damaged pavement, and debris from earlier fighting created natural bottlenecks. In such settings, mobility can become a liability. While motorcycles can evade heavier systems in open areas, their options narrow significantly when routes constrict. The initial engagement exploited these spatial constraints, turning the environment itself into a limiting factor. Observers of ground combat frequently emphasize that terrain can determine outcomes well before direct contact occurs. As the situation stabilized, it became evident that this was not an uncontrolled skirmish, but a measured operation designed to exploit vulnerability while avoiding unnecessary escalation. There were no reckless advances or exposed pursuits. Each action was tied to restricting options and increasing uncertainty for the opposing force. At this stage, the distinct roles of different Ukrainian assets became clearer. Following the initial disruption, pressure was applied with precision rather than force concentration. FPV drones and sniper teams played a central role in this phase. First-person view drones became a primary means of maintaining pressure on the disintegrating convoy. Rather than employing heavy explosives over wide areas, these drones targeted remaining vehicles and light transport with high accuracy. Operating at low altitude, they used real-time video feeds to track movement while minimizing risk to Ukrainian personnel. According to a report by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, FPV drones have significantly reshaped engagements in Ukraine by enabling rapid, precise strikes while reducing exposure of ground forces. Their persistent presence limited the ability of opposing units to regroup or escape. As remaining riders attempted to disperse, drone operators continued to track movement, steadily reducing available space. Research from the Center for Strategic and International Studies highlights how sustained aerial observation can impose psychological pressure by making even minor movement hazardous, slowing decision-making and increasing hesitation. Snipers complemented this approach in a manner that contrasts with popular portrayals. Rather than acting independently, they were used strategically to cover routes of withdrawal and further restrict movement. Their role was not to dominate the engagement through spectacle, but to reinforce spatial control and deny escape options. Their fire was not intended to impress or intimidate, but to serve specific tactical objectives. Each shot was coordinated with live drone feeds, ensuring that sniper activity aligned precisely with observed movement on the ground. This method differs substantially from popular portrayals that depict snipers as independent actors. In practice, their effectiveness relies on coordination, communication, and timing, with drone surveillance guiding fields of fire that restrict retreat and prevent regrouping. The combined use of FPV drones and sniper teams produced sustained operational pressure rather than brief, explosive force, even during pauses in firing, the persistent presence of drones overhead. And snipers in concealed positions limited the opposing force's ability to move decisively. This continuous pressure narrowed available routes and increased the likelihood of interception. Research on urban combat dynamics suggests that such persistent constraint can degrade cohesion as effectively as direct assault, particularly when the psychological burden of limited escape options slows decision-making. This approach challenges several common assumptions about modern ground combat. Public commentary often frames drones as tools for dramatic strikes and snipers as isolated specialists. In operational reality, these assets function as components of an integrated system, prioritizing control of movement and information flow over individual feats or visible destruction. The primary measure of success was not the number of vehicles disabled, but the extent to which remaining elements of the convoy were confined to positions where further action became impractical or excessively risky. This emphasis on containment, rather than spectacle, marks a clear distinction between battlefield practice and its representation in media or propaganda. On social platforms, FPV drones are frequently shown conducting high-impact strikes, while snipers are portrayed operating under idealized conditions. Conditions on the ground were far more complex. Operators balanced aggression with restraint, selecting moments that offered strategic advantage without exposing their own positions. Experts associated with the Ukraine Defense Contact Group have noted that this combination of tools reflects a broader tactical shift toward information dominance and controlled targeting rather than relying on massed firepower alone. Through this integration, Ukrainian units were able to seal the area around Tourett without escalating into uncontrolled confrontation. Drone coverage applied constant pressure across access routes, while sniper positions restricted key corridors, gradually reducing the convoy's ability to function as a coordinated unit. By the time the engagement reached its natural conclusion, remaining opponents were constrained not by superior numbers, but by sustained surveillance and restricted mobility. At that point, the critical consideration shifted from further attack to determining when to disengage. Following the controlled disruption of the motorcycle convoy, Ukrainian forces did not pursue aggressively. Instead, they focused on stabilizing the immediate area. Once drone pressure and coordinated fire had reduced the opposing forces' ability to maneuver, Ukrainian units moved to secure access routes and points of cover previously used by the convoy. This phase emphasized observation and verification rather than renewed assault. Small areas were cleared methodically and potential threats were assessed before movement continued. According to reporting by the United States Institute of Peace, disciplined consolidation after an engagement reduces vulnerability to counterattack and lowers the risk of ambush. Consistent with this assessment, Ukrainian troops advanced cautiously toward nearby structures where remaining elements might have sought shelter. This phase unfolded deliberately. Units relied on additional drone feeds to survey forward positions and examine terrain features that could conceal residual resistance. This approach contrasts with earlier doctrines that emphasized rapid territorial gains, favoring instead a measured pace that prioritizes force protection and situational awareness. Analysts at the Atlantic Council have observed that modern engagements increasingly reward this form of controlled, incremental dominance over rapid but exposed advances. Indicators of remaining hostile presence were monitored closely, but escalation was avoided unless direct threats were confirmed. Avoiding unnecessary combat in newly secured areas reduced risks to both troops and civilians and helped preserve unit cohesion. Research from the Modern War Institute indicates that maintaining discipline after initial success limits operational fatigue and conserves combat power for future actions. In this way, the events around Tourett reflect broader lessons emerging from the conflict in Ukraine. Holding ground effectively requires knowing when to consolidate rather than press forward without sufficient information. Military scholars consistently warn that overextension can invite counterattacks and unnecessary losses, particularly in unfamiliar or damaged terrain. For the Ukrainian units involved, this meant establishing secure forward positions along the convoy's last known routes and adjacent shelter areas, then pausing to reassess and redistribute resources before any further movement. This methodical approach allowed commanders time to assess potential threats, account for all units, and confirm that no remaining elements of the convoy were regrouping nearby. It also created space for engineers and support teams to begin clearing obstacles or hazards that could pose risks to future movement. The focus was on prevention rather than pursuit, reflecting a subtle but important shift in how ground is managed after an engagement. Research from the RAND Corporation indicates that such post-engagement consolidation reduces casualties and lowers the risk of unintended clashes, including encounters involving non-combatants. This measured advance did more than secure physical space. It reinforced a psychological advantage for Ukrainian forces. Confidence grew from knowing that decisions prioritized calculated judgment over impulsive action. In conflicts where morale and cohesion are as critical as firepower, this discipline can influence how units perform in later engagements. Encouraging reliance on collective planning rather than instinctive reaction, the events around Tourett also highlight a broader evolution in how battlefield momentum is understood. Success is not always defined by constant forward movement or by claiming every available position. Often it involves holding what has already been gained with vigilance and restraint, recognizing that new threats may not be immediately visible. This perspective treats control as dynamic and fragile, and it values consolidation as a strategic choice rather than a pause in action. A separate incident later in the conflict further illustrates how restraint can be as decisive as firepower. In another operation, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces encountered a situation that tested judgment rather than resolve. During a close-range reconnaissance mission, they identified enemy troops occupying a multi-story building that had been prepared for defense. The structure provided strong firing lanes, protected positions, and limited access points, giving the defenders a clear tactical advantage. From their external observation points, Ukrainian forces quickly assessed the situation. Any direct assault would have required advancing into concentrated fire from elevated positions and confined interior spaces. The defenders held numerical superiority and heavier weapons, while the Ukrainian unit operated with limited manpower and no assurance of immediate reinforcement. Military doctrine has long cautioned against frontal attacks on prepared positions, particularly in urban environments where elevation and confined terrain increase risk. U.S. Army field manuals on urban operations note that even highly trained units can suffer severe losses when attacking fortified structures without surprise or a clear advantage. Under these conditions, Ukrainian commanders made a decision that rarely features in dramatic depictions of combat. They withdrew. The withdrawal was conducted deliberately and in stages. Personnel disengaged methodically, tracks were concealed, and no equipment was left behind. Contact was broken before the opposing force fully understood what had occurred. Analysis from the Modern War Institute at West Point emphasizes that disciplined withdrawals preserve combat power and help prevent losses that could undermine long-term operational effectiveness. This choice reflects a level of battlefield maturity that is often misunderstood outside professional military circles. Withdrawal is frequently framed as failure in public narratives shaped by propaganda or entertainment. In operational reality, avoiding an unwinnable engagement protects experienced personnel needed for future missions. NATO trainee. NG doctrine consistently stresses that preserving force readiness is as important as seizing ground, especially in prolonged conflicts where attrition plays a larger role than single engagements. Defense analysts at RAND have similarly noted that elite units succeed not through constant engagement, but by selecting battles that align with broader operational objectives rather than emotional or symbolic pressure. In the context of the war in Ukraine, this incident carries a clear message. Not every contact requires an attack. Not every advantage must be pressed immediately. In some situations, the most effective decision is to disengage, reassess, and wait for conditions to change. This form of restraint does not weaken a force. It strengthens it. What occurred around Tourett is only one part of a wider pattern. In the days that followed, similar dynamics were observed elsewhere, including along the Dnipro River, where Ukrainian FPV drones struck Russian patrol boats moving through waterways previously considered relatively secure. While not directly connected to Tourett, the operation followed the same underlying logic. Russian forces relied on movement and distance, while Ukrainian units relied on observation, timing, and precision. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies note that Russian river patrols have become increasingly vulnerable as drone operations expand into environments once viewed as low risk. This shift is significant. It suggests that Russia is losing more than equipment. It is losing safe operating space. Land routes, waterways, and supply corridors are increasingly exposed to persistent surveillance and targeted strikes, with no single system offering complete protection. Modern warfare increasingly rewards judgment over impulse and precision over slogans. Outcomes are shaped less by dramatic advances and more by disciplined decision-making under uncertainty. If you are looking for clear, grounded analysis of how these dynamics continue to evolve, consider following military force as the battlefield continues to change.